if Russia is as much of a threat as European governments like the United Kingdom are saying, which I think I basically agree, then the clear logical deduction is to shoulder more burden. The one thing I would say is, look, defense input spending is really important, and you can't get around it, but that's ultimately an input measure. What really we need to see are fielded, combat credible European military forces that are able to deal with the Russians.
Let me ask you this first. I'm going to be discussing American foreign policy, pretty much principally here, and we're talking as the new vice presidential running mate has the stage, and I wonder what that means. What does that mean? The arrival of JD Vance. What does that tell us about the shape and the direction of American policy if there's to be a change of administration towards starting with NATO?
Well, thanks. Good to be with you and your listeners. And just to be clear, I don't speak for President Trump or Senator Vance or the campaign. So just give my own views. I mean, I think I think we have the best reflection of the Trump-Vance approach probably in the platform, and I mean what President Trump himself has said, what Senator Vance said to Sean Hannity the other night, and what we'll look forward to seeing what he says this evening. Very exciting. I mean, I for one am very enthusiastic, exceptionally enthusiastic about the pick of Senator Vance. I think it does represent kind of a passing of the torch or the beginning of a passing of a torch. Obviously, President Trump is at the top of the lineup, but it sort of represents a kind of a generational, link up, if you will. President Trump talked a lot about Senator Vance's extraordinary record. I think Senator Vance has had a very clear perspective in the Senate. I certainly count myself very aligned with. But I think when you look at the platform, it's a common sense. America first. So, I mean, I think the word common sense was used a lot. So to me, I think the message to allies, I know I was around the NATO summit, I talk to Europeans all the time. There's a lot of Sturm und Drang, there's a lot of hand-wringing, there's a lot of fear and concern and so forth. But I think the main message, and actually Senator Vance said this in Munich, is basically it's a wake-up call that the Europeans in particular, but also others like the Taiwanese and the Japanese, really need to step up and shoulder a much larger part of the burden. Obviously, the United Kingdom has maintained a much more significant defense capability over the last few years and last decades has been involved in many of the military operations. So UK is a bit different. But I think that's the main message. The direction of travel is clear. A focus on reindustrialization, if you look at the platform, a focus on restarting the American economy, energy independence, a strong military used more sparingly was what the platform said, sparingly. That reminds me a lot of the Weinberger Doctrine under President Reagan. So I think that's the sort of, you can see, because that's where you see probably the sort of the trend going.
Right, okay, so it is fair to say that Donald Trump's rhetoric so far, which has been clear, it's been pretty transparent, has had the effect of driving up the level of defense spending among NATO.
Which is good, which is a favor.
Which is a plus.
It's actually better than offering sweet nothings and false assurances.
Which is a plus, yeah. and you could say in that sense it's paid off.
Yeah.
And you're following that up by saying, listen, just read the writing, which is very clear on the wall. If you do not spend a significant amount more on your own European defense, you're going to be in trouble. It'll be your fault, not America's fault. That's your message.
Well, I think that's manifestly true in the sense that, don't take it from me. I mean, General Cavoli, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander, has said that 2% is an inadequate level. I mean, look, Boris Pistorius, the Minister of Defense in Germany, Social Democrat, has said 3.5%.
Yes.
The United Kingdom, under both governments of both the Tory and the Labour Party, are saying that Britain needs to raise funding. So it's actually less about what Americans think. That is important, the fairness and equity point of view. But Europe simply needs to have more military capacity because the United States does not have, this is something Senator Vance has been very articulate about. We don't have a multi-theater military. We can't fight multiple wars at the same time. We've denuded our defense industrial base. We don't have a tremendous amount of money lying around to spend on this stuff. So, if Russia is as much of a threat as European governments like the United Kingdom are saying, which I think I basically agree, then the clear logical deduction is to shoulder more burden. The one thing I would say is, look, defense input spending is really important, and you can't get around it, but that's ultimately an input measure. What really we need to see are fielded, combat-credible European military forces that are able to deal with the Russians. Right. And look, that's viable. The British Army of the Rhine a generation ago, certainly the Bundeswehr of 1988. This is something European societies can do. They just need to decide to do it. Look at the Poles. They're spending 5% of GDP on defense.
As we speak, there are something of the order of 100,000 US troops based in continental Europe. There are 8 garrisons across Europe. In the United Kingdom, we know we have long established, since the end of the Second World War, an Air Force, an American Air Force presence on RAF on bases. That 100,000 strong force, that spread of US military resources, when you talk to me about using your resources sparingly, you're saying that scale of American commitment, it's got to come down.
Well, look, I think it's very clear. When I worked on the defense strategy under President Trump, we shifted focus to China, to East Asia. That's got to be the priority, I think, as Senator Vance said the other day to Sean Hannity on Fox News. And we haven't really followed through on that. I mean, we've got a very big presence in Europe. We've got a big presence in the Middle East. We've got our forces all over the world. You got limited resources. We have limited time. We can't fix all our problems immediately. We got to focus. We got to focus our scarce resources. And in fact, we've spent almost $200 billion in Ukraine, or supporting Ukraine and in Europe and so forth in the last couple of years. We have our priorities out of whack. Right. And that's why, I think smart Europeans who see the writing on the wall are understanding that we're going to have to shift focus towards Asia. And the best thing for Europe to do to keep NATO strong, to sustain NATO, is for the European pillar of NATO to lead.
Right, and that's a message which has been, not the first time we've heard this, that's been a pretty consistent message for some time from the camp of Donald Trump. Now, very famously now, Donald Trump, on that political platform, said if European NATO members don't stand up and provide for their own defense, Vladimir Putin can do what the hell he likes. That's an exact quote. And that phrase echoed around the world. Should we take it literally? Was he really telling Putin that he can do what the hell he likes, where countries are not putting their shoulder to the wheel in NATO?
Well, I don't speak for
no,
President
in your
Trump,
opinion.
But I think what Senator Vance said, that this is a wake-up call. I mean, if you really care about the Europeans, you have to generate the sense of urgency. And let's be honest, the Europeans pretty much ignored. I mean, they ignored Barack Obama when he complained about this. They ignored Robert Gates when he talked about this. Frankly, there's the infamous picture of the Germans laughing when President Trump was talking about Nord Stream 2. So frankly, in order to get through and get the attention that's necessary, well, first of all, unfortunately, there had to be, in part, a huge invasion of Ukraine. But also, a lot of what's happening, I was participating in some events around the NATO summit. There was all this discussion of quote-unquote Trump-proofing, which basically involved people thinking that President Trump might come back, so spending more on defense and taking more responsibility in defense. Well, that's what they should be doing anyway. So, I mean, people are they're getting the attention that's needed, and the message is getting through in a way that's like a real clear signal that people are actually not ignoring.
It was pretty clear. It put the wind up, as we say in Britain, an awful lot of people. What I'm asking you, though, and I know you don't speak directly for for Donald Trump, but when he said that, Vladimir Putin can do what the hell he likes when it comes to NATO partners in Europe if they're not paying up for their own defense. Do you think he meant that?
Well, look, I mean, President Trump has said he doesn't, I believe he said the other day that he doesn't think we should get out of NATO, and NATO involves the United States coming to the effective defense of NATO. So if you asked me, what I would say is, Mr. President, my advice would be that we should come to the aid of a NATO allies attacked by Russia, but do so in a way that's consistent with prioritizing our focus on the Pacific, which would mean withholding key assets. This is what I've been saying for the last year or two. Ultimately, that's a presidential decision. I think it's the obligation of the foreign and security establishment and those who kind of make arguments in this field to build the best posture possible to have a good option there. Ultimately, that's an American decision, but I believe the NATO alliance is a very, very important part of our foreign policy. It's obviously a vital part of Europe. But the best way to be ready for this kind of situation for us both is both to be prepared, and that particularly involves the Europeans stepping up.
So look, if it were to come to the point where, let's say, Vladimir Putin threatened or invaded a NATO ally, you're saying, in your view, America should be there ready to join the line, but you're also saying maybe only up to a point.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Only up to a point.
Yeah, not because out of a principle or but because we have a military that we've recognized does not have the capacity to fight multiple large wars, and if we break our spear in Europe, then the Chinese would, in a sense, would be crazy to attack not along the first island chain. If we want to avoid World War III, as President Trump says, and I think is a real risk, and I think we should, we've got to be strong against the primary rival, which is China. Measured strength. I'm not one of those people who thinks we should try to regime change China or pursue primacy or dominance over China. I think we want a balance of power, but we have to do that from a position of strength.
Okay, let's talk about Ukraine.
Okay.
European leaders are meeting on Thursday at Blenheim Palace. Ukraine's going to be on the agenda. Should Ukraine be worried? Should Ukraine be frightened at the possibility of a Trump-Vance White House?
Well, I think if they're meeting at Blenheim Palace, then it's the legacy of Winston Churchill probably. Well, Winston Churchill's advice was, let's rearm, right? That was the advice. And so I think the best thing, I was talking to some German parliamentarians yesterday who were sort of saying, oh, you just need to do Reagan and you need to just double defense spending. And I said, gentlemen, with respect, why don't you turn that argument to yourselves? And if you're so concerned about the problem, these are huge economies. The European economies together are roughly on the same order of magnitude as the United States, a bit smaller, growing less. But there's a lot you can do. I think the Europeans should continue to support and take the lead. That's what President Trump said in his Truth Social post. Again, I can't speak for President Trump. My advice would be we can continue to help the Ukrainians in ways that don't decrement from our ability to strengthen our posture in Asia. But we've already sent over almost $200 billion, an enormous amount of critical weaponry that will take a long time to restock. So I think, hey, that's a great argument for the people of Britain, people of France, the people of Germany, the people of Italy to really remilitarize their defense industrial bases, restore their defense industrial bases, and build military capability both to support the Ukrainians and to support and to defend themselves. I got to tell you though, John, one thing I see a lot of like sort of existential rhetoric from a lot of European countries. This was one of the things that really bothered me about former Foreign Secretary Cameron. He would say it was an apocalyptic battle, and he would come here and he would say how important it was for the Americans to do more. And then I looked at what the British were sending to Ukraine. It was about £3 billion a year. I mean, the American people have sent almost 200 billion. The President Macron of France, very existential battle. This is talking about putting troops in and expanding the war. And when you look at actual French aid to Ukraine, much lower. The Germans have been doing a bit better on military aid to Ukraine, except I just saw in the news today that it's being reported by Reuters that Scholz is going to actually cut Ukraine aid and has also denied Minister of Defense's Defense Pistorius' full request for the Zeitenwende that Scholz talks about. So really, put your money where your mouth is, and then both it'll be more fair, it'll be more reasonable request for the Americans, but also one cannot but sense a bit of hypocrisy and a bit of posturing. If the situation was as grave as you suggest, why don't you just spend what the American people are spending? I would say when the polls talk to me, I have to give them a hearing because these are people who are spending 5% of GDP on defense. They're acting like they're taking this threat as if it's existential. I don't always agree with them, but I have to take that very seriously. If President Macron or David Cameron or somebody is lecturing us, I have to say, well, really, like how serious is it if it's really not changing your fundamental policies? The last government in the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Sunak and Foreign Secretary Cameron would repeatedly talk about the existential threat, the threat from Russia, et cetera. Then your chief of army said, oh, well, I guess maybe we have to consider conscription. And then Prime Minister Sunak
ex-chief of the army.
Exactly. QED, right?
Well, no, he was an ex-chief when
but he was shot down.
He was shot down.
So, I mean, look, I think Europe would have a lot more standing on this issue if it was actually, show me a budget and I'll show you your priorities.
Okay, you're saying put your money where your own mouth is before you talk to us in America.
Exactly.
However, the American warnings have gone beyond that from President Trump and very explicitly from JD Vance in word and in writing. Mm-hmm. He has said he'd be prepared to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, using the enormous supply of American munitions as leverage to do that. And at that negotiating table, there's no point in being there unless you're talking about Ukraine giving up large amounts of territory. Would that be the object, do you believe, of policy if it came to it and Trump and Vance were in the White House?
Well, my understanding is President Trump has not gotten into specifics about.
No, he has said,
and that's the authoritative.
No, he has indeed. So he has said he would seek a solution in 24 hours. Right. I don't take that literally, 24 hours. Maybe I should. But JD Vance has said he will drive Ukraine to the table with Putin.
He's said that since he's been named as.
No, indeed. Well, that was only the other day.
He's now the vice presidential ticket. I mean, he's obviously an incredibly important voice, but President Trump is the top of the ticket, obviously. So I think President and the campaign has said, if President Trump says something, that's the authoritative source on the issue. Well, I think it's important because
No, I recognize. Are you saying that's not going to be the position?
no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying I think we need to go off what President Trump has said, as far as I understand.
Well, he said 24 hours.
Right, so that is what he said. My own view on that subject is, I support the effort to make peace in Ukraine. I think a couple things. One, it's customary for presidential candidates, particularly Republican presidential candidates, to have peace plans that they don't reveal the details of. That was true of Eisenhower in 1952 about Korea. It was true of Nixon in 1968 about Vietnam. And it was true about Reagan in 1980 on the hostage crisis. So it's, you don't tip your cards before and you want to maintain leverage and you want to maintain.
But before you go on, let me put this to you.
Okay.
Another who is quite close, as I understand it, to Donald Trump, Sebastian Gorka, he has said in terms, this is the plan, and the plan was to tell Ukraine that you will stop getting our support unless you go to the table, and to tell Russia, you get to the table or we'll pour support in against you.
Well, the campaign has been very clear that President Trump is the only one who speaks. So, honestly, I certainly don't claim to know I know there have been plans out there, and they may be, varying degrees of credibility or varying degrees of viability. But I think the one thing that we need to stick to is what President Trump himself has said. That is what the campaign has repeatedly said is the authoritative source.
Okay.
So I've said that about the precedent for having a kind of degree of ambiguity and opacity on exactly what the tactics are in the negotiation that preserves negotiating space. Okay. I think, though, to your question, I think in any case Ukraine is going to have to be supported both militarily to maintain because if it does look like an armistice, something like Korea, the Ukrainians are going to need to have a capable military, but that's got to be primarily the Europeans doing that. And in terms, first of all, the Biden administration official policy is this war will end through negotiation, and the Biden administration is also telling the New York Times and testifying and so forth, according to our intelligence community, that the battle lines are unlikely to be substantially redrawn. So we can, are we going to deal with reality? I think it's better to deal with reality.
So whatever happens, you kind of imagine the battle lines being frozen where they are.
Are you suggesting that the Ukrainians are going to be able to retake Crimea and go back to 2014?
It's not for me, Mr. Colby, to suggest anything.
Because it is, but you're implying something that, look, again, to get back to the point, if people are out there suggesting, for instance, a European parliamentarian I started to use, the Ukrainians need to prevail, and I said, you're cutting defense aid to Ukraine. Does that help the Ukrainians? Does that help us? Look, the Russians have mobilized their economy for war. They clearly are able to man their army and so forth. Obviously, they're having problems, thank God, that they're having difficulty with breakthroughs. But, I think we've got to deal with more or less a realistic picture. That may hopefully involve the Ukrainians retaking some territory. I don't know. But I think, magical solutions. And there have been a lot of magical solutions put out there that, if we give them an F-16, they'll push the Russians out, the Russian government will fall apart. That's not going to work.
You're telling Ukraine they're going to have to be realistic. Yeah. Last quick one, I know time's pressing. We now have a new government in London. It's a Labour government. Last time we spoke, that hadn't been settled. What is your thinking, your impressions of the new Labour government in London? You've met David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, my initial impressions, and speaking as an American conservative, how I would vote if I were Britain might be different, but looking at it as an American, I think if you look at the platform and what it says and the foreign policy that's being espoused, it's a common sense, practical, America first foreign policy. So that means working with governments, especially allies, that are self-reliant, practical, focused, and realistic. And I think what we've heard from the new Labour government in the United Kingdom is quite consistent with that. Not only Mr. Lammy, but Mr. Healey, the Defense Secretary, saying, hey, look, the British military has been in bad shape, partially because of former Prime Minister Cameron, but also for broader reasons, et cetera, et cetera. We need to focus, we need to be more realistic. This idea of a tilt and Britain being in Asia. No. We got to focus on Europe. This is where our interests really lie, maybe a bit in the Near East. I think, to me, that's a very viable basis for collaboration between the United States and the United Kingdom, even though they're governments of different ideological
That's almost
questions.
An endorsement.
Well, I don't endorse, it's not my place to endorse a foreign government, and a particular party. But I do want to make clear that I think the common sense America First foreign policy is very consistent, potentially, with governments of a range of ideological complexions.
Okay, almost in a word. If, as is suggested, may well happen, you are offered the job of National Security Advisor in a Trump presidency, would you take it?
Well, look, I don't make any presumptions about having any kind of role, certainly a role of that sort of seniority. What I would say is I would be honored to serve in a Trump administration, and in ways that I could make a positive impact. I do believe, very sincerely, that we're at a tremendously dangerous period, and I was one of the people who discounted that kind of rhetoric 20 years ago. I believe the kind of foreign policy that I'm advocating for is the right one, and it's consistent with President Trump and Senator Vance are talking about. I believe it's up to them to judge. So I would be honored to contribute, but that's ultimately going to be up to them.
Elbridge Colby, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.